But let's see what can happen elsewhere in, say, the small town of Mosinee, Wisconsin. Peaceful, isn't it? But the red truncheon falls and the chief of police is hustled off to jail. Next, public utilities are seized by fifth colonists. Watch carefully what happens to an editor who operates under a free press. He goes to jail, too, and his newspaper is confiscated. Exit freedom of thought. Yes, this is life under the Soviet form of government. The little town of Mosinee made this experiment for 24 hours, a public service to all America. It can't happen here? Well, this is what it looks like if it should.
Hello, and welcome to History Chats. Oh, hold on. Let me see. Fix that. Yeah, so, sorry, I was in the middle of changing something here, so I wasn't quite ready for this to be done. A little different introduction here, because this is a little different program. So, yeah, hold on. There we go. Let me go to the full thing here. Oh, you didn't see that yet. Yeah, so welcome to History Chats. Something interesting today. Some of you probably clicking on this video and watching it probably wouldn't know, but the advertising that we did up to this point, I kind of, for some reason, thought it would be kind of a fun opportunity to do a little have the communists take over History Chats for the day. Just as a mock communist takeover of Mosinee happened, was that 73 years ago this week in Mosinee, Wisconsin. Now, partially, I thought that, setting it up as like a baseball game, sort of a very American thing, and then we kind of pulled the switch. Also, the rest of the month, we don't really have a very tight theme, but I kind of went with this art style of Schoolhouse Rock and sort of that era, and trying to explain communist takeover felt hard to do. So, but anyway, we're not going to dwell too much on that. We're just going to get into it. Yeah, as you saw in that film footage, which, by the way, I don't entirely know what the origin of that is. That's on a VHS tape that we have in our collection that I digitized for the program here. The program ends up going out and continuing to talk about advertising a shopping center in Astoria, New York. So it's probably not local, but it does a good job of kind of articulating what happened. But just so that we're clear, I think it's worth talking about, starting with a little caveat, which is that it's not an actual takeover by communists of Mosinee. They're not actually communists. These are mostly members of the American Legion and volunteers who are pretending to be communists from out of town. And they didn't really take over as like a, seizing power sort of thing. They kind of just voluntarily said, yeah, well, you can have power and we'll kind of pretend like we are under communist rule as part of an educational sort of event. So, before anybody, starts this and goes, oh, communists actually, no, and that's kind of the intention, right? They didn't want to make, they want to make it very clear. And when I say this, like these two caveats, this is not just me making this caveat. It's like every single piece of media that covers this contemporarily at the time goes out of their way to say, very heavy use of quotations and very clear that like, don't worry, we don't actually have a communists, the Russians haven't invaded Mosinee, Wisconsin. This is actually just sort of they called it a stunt or a pageant. They didn't really want anybody like, all right, let's load up our trucks, get our guns, and let's take back Mosinee. Like, they want to make it very clear, don't worry, it's not real. The idea originally emerged, so this is this is 1950. right? There's a lot of context that we could go over about the Cold War starting and sort of the deepening of it. But I guess the point right here is, within about a year of this event, in 1949, NATO gets formed, and later that month in April, the Russians, the Soviets test their first nuclear weapon successfully. In 1950, we are going to see the communists take over, take the mainland in China. The Korean War is going to start. There's this real concern about this Soviet threat and the communists and, the outsides after World War II. And then, of course, there's this very big concern about who among us might be part of the communist movement. There was very high profile, trials of, Elgar Hiss and folks that were like, seemingly all-American, and they're actually spying for the Soviets. Who else might be, all of that. And in that context, there was a lawyer, attorney from Milwaukee named John Decker. This is him in the 1970s. He becomes the first Chief Justice of the newly created State Appeals Court. So he's got a long and storied career. But back in 1950, he's just a budding young attorney in Milwaukee. He's a member of the American Legion, veteran of World War II. And they had been doing all of these sort of like educational things of, having a parade to co-opt, on like, often there were in the late 40s attempts to try to co-opt the actual communists. So like co-opt is probably the wrong word. Kind of have a big event, like a big parade the day before May Day, so that the May Day, the coverage is going to be kind of muddied and stuff like that. There's a lot of attempts to try to explain, like, no, seriously, the communists are the threat, and we need to be careful and be vigilant. And he kind of thought about it as, the idea is there, but not everybody is going to listen to a speech and have a real, force themselves to consider what it would be like. Not everybody's going to watch a parade and go, what would it be like if I was, under communist rule? And he thought, wouldn't it be interesting? There are certain people that maybe would benefit from more of an immersive educational experience. And in early 1850, in February, he's, riding down to a meeting or something like that with a friend of his who's like the media sort of relations person for the American Legion in Wisconsin. And he kind of mentions this, and they like the idea. They pitch it up. Before long, the National American Legion is involved. They grab onto it really quickly. The idea starts to kind of fracture in terms of like, Decker's original inspiration was this would be a great opportunity for a community. Like if we have a community go communist, pretend to be, they would then have to really deeply consider what it would be like. And then there were others like the folks in Indianapolis at the national headquarters that were like, this is going to be great for the headlines. We're going to be able to get media involved, and it's going to be great doing that. And for the moment, these things kind of coincide. In the practice of the actual execution of the takeover, we'll see. Maybe it dilutes things. But, for now, they move ahead. And they settle on Mosinee. Now, Mosinee is an interesting choice. There's a couple good reasons for this. It is a very typical American city. It's sort of on the come up. It's still pretty small. There's only about 1,400 people living there. But it's got all the things you need that any American city would need, right? It's got a high school. It's got, theaters and restaurants. It's got, a bunch of Protestant and Catholic churches. It's got a big industry with the paper company, as well as a couple other businesses and things like that. It's large enough that it can be representative of, the all-American city, but it's also small enough that they could kind of keep tabs. Like one of the other advantages is it only has 3 roads in and out, and there's a river on one side. So we can kind of lock it down if we need to. They also didn't want, like, in addition to not wanting to let people get the wrong idea about it actually being communist takeover, they also didn't want to let the actual communists know that they were planning this, right? Because if you try to do this in Milwaukee, not only do you have a problem of like, it's a lot of people that are not going to be aware what's going on. In a community of like 1,400 people, you can basically get the word out really quickly and everybody can kind of be on the same page. Whether they like it or not, they at least will know what's going on. And even in like a city like Wausau or Stevens Point or like just a couple more thousand people living there, it gets a little iffy. And then if there's actual communists involved, another big reason is there's not actual known communists here. So they're not going to like disrupt the proceedings. And then the other thing that is also worth noting is some locals, and particularly Francis Schweinler. I'm not know how to pronounce his last name, so I apologize if I'm butchering that. Schweinler. He is at this point in the Army Reserves, but he was a brigadier general, kind of retired from active service and he runs the Mosinee Times, the local newspaper. He's a member of the American Legion. He finds out about this and he goes, let's make this happen. I love it. Mosinee is your place. And see, he and a couple other people, of course, it's not just him, but he kind of brings it to Mosinee and kind of becomes the main sort of coordinator for the locals. In fact, this is a letter that was sent out in advance, which I'm going to read out here because I think it does a good job of explaining what the people would have known. Dear citizen, as you know, on May 1st, the eyes and the ears of the entire world will be focused on Mosinee when the American Legion, Mosinee, Day under Communist rule is put into effect. Truly, the entire world will be watching, since the most outstanding news and picture services, newsreels and magazines will put out the story wherever free men have access to free news. In the main, this object lesson in Americanism, by actually living for a day in the same matter that people are forced to live in communist-controlled lands, is more important by far than any amount of platform speeches or magazine articles or parades. But it cannot succeed. It cannot do the job for which it is intended without your cooperation, because you are the person who is revealing to the world how it is to live under communists. We earnestly solicit your cooperation in the interests of good Americanism. Enclosed are the following items, and there's a bunch of permits and things like that. He says, also enclosed is a red star to wear on your lapel. If you are wearing it, the mock communist government, which will take over Mosinee, will know that you are willing to play along, and you will voluntarily subject yourself to a few harmless inconveniences. Fill in your name on those items that need your name and sign my name where it is required. Will you wear this red star? Will you cooperate with us? If you do, you can be assured that the most effective Americanism program in history will be staged on May 1st and will resound to the everlasting credit of Mosinee. So there's a couple things that are worth noting here. He is very much pitching this as this is good for us, but also recognize that we're trying to get the media to show this. And we want everybody's cooperation, but also, you don't have to. And that's an important part of this too, that's often commented on at the time. You could take part if you wanted to, but if you didn't feel like you wanted to pretend to be communist, or I don't know that they would have explicitly said this, but if you disagreed with the whole thing on principle, you could just go about your day. And it would be a little inconvenient to have the roads, the extra people and everything, but that's fine. You don't need to. As long as you're not like making trouble, you're good. Also, just interesting to note that these entry permits and exit permits and ration permits, I was surprised to see he had cleared all of these individually, but then reading this, it's like, oh, just fill in my name. So this is not his signature. But you can see that these are, designed and distributed to the public well in advance of the day. Well, not well in advance. The whole thing, again, it was the whole concept was conceived by Decker initially like in February of 1950, and then the thing happens in May 1st. So it's a pretty quick turnover, but you can see a lot of effort went into this. There's also an itinerary. They have scheduled this out. It is scripted down to the half hour, and in some cases 15 minutes about the things that are happening. And we'll go through the course of the day over the course of the rest of the program here, but just to note that there are this is designed for the media. Many of these things are, something that the public can take part in, but most of them, I would say most of them are probably not something that most of the citizens of Mosinee are designed to do. And in fact, on the bottom here, it says professional workers of all kinds who need typewriters to do their job will find one available at the American Legion. And then Western Union will have 5 wires open for press dispatches to the Milwaukee Railroad Station. Basically, there's lines out if you need to get your story published. They're really trying to make it easy for those sort of people. Now, they did, in advance, of course, get the people of Mosinee on board, not just the general public, but some of the other, city leaders, the mayor, the city council, members of the businesses and clergy, even members of the local at the paper factory, the union. And they were kind of pitched the idea. Apparently, in the room, they were a little lukewarm about the whole thing. Not that they disagreed with the message, but it's just hard to conceive what it would look like. But they agreed. And so we move forward on May 1st. So how does the day play out? Well, I'm going to break this up into phases. They don't explicitly do this, but I think that there's sort of a conception of this. Here's how the takeover happens. So the first day, right away in the morning, as 6 a.m., right as things get started, people get up, seize control. And you're going to do this with armed guards. Again, all of the so-called communists were from American Legion and other volunteers from outside of the community. Again, they didn't want to create tensions within the community by getting people the idea that they were actually communist and whatever. So they wanted to make sure that it also felt like foreigners coming in, which was the conception of communism that they're going for. It's also worth noting, I guess I probably should have said this at the beginning, the depiction of communism that they're going for is not, probably goes without saying, a genuine example of a genuine opportunity to engage in a real discussion with what the communists in the United States wanted to see happen. It is a caricature, a cartoonish depiction of what they wanted it to be. And while I would love to go out, and I will talk a little bit here about how the communists that they are creating are being depicted. I think it's better to think of it not as much as these are what the communists are, but rather the communists were sort of the aspects that are highlighted, even in the course of the day here. These are all things that are contrary to what we think we need as Americans. So they went through and they identified what makes us unique, what makes us important, what gives us strength as a community. Is it the church? Is it our democracy? Is it capitalism? And then they found examples that go contrary to that. And so then you can kind of see how, whatever. But one of the things that they do is very clearly they're trying to show that communists, if they come into your community, they're going to be violent, they're going to use force. And so they did have these guys from outside with, lots of weapons. Apparently they were unarmed, or not armed, unloaded, of course, but still, weapons. And they start by arresting people, starting with Mayor Kronenwetter, who, here he is being pulled from his home in his pajamas. Just a little bit. I'm going to try not to do too much of this, but I probably will anyway. It's not the most genuine thing, because again, this is not something that the general public is. This is mostly for the press. And the press actually had them do it a few times because, hey, that first time you weren't really gentle enough. You were a little gentle. Could you be a little rougher? Hey, these guys didn't get a chance to get a good photograph. Could we do it again? So they did it 3 or 4 times. There's a reason that it takes an hour to go from one house to another to arrest people. But still, that's not the point. It really is designed to show a story. So Mayor Kronenwetter, then they go to the police chief. They then execute the police chief half an hour later. They don't actually execute them. Basically, they say, hey, turn over your officers to our control. And he says no, and then they shoot him. And that was basically as a way of keeping him, they needed to show that he was being arrested, but they actually didn't want to have him keep appearing over the course of the day. They needed him to do his job and direct traffic and be around. So by killing him off, so-called, they were able to let him do his job. Then they went and seized the Mosinee paper mill through violent seizure, apparently. Didn't look very violent. The film clip that I showed, if you saw that, they were just leading somebody away. They also leave the rest of the Mosinee paper mill intact under capitalist control for a couple hours, but we'll touch on that later. And then, of course, arresting the clergymen, who, despite the communists having 2.5 hours of control of the city, some of them are just pulled off the pulpit as they're in the middle of giving a homily. Again, good for the cameras. I don't know that there was genuinely that many people going to church services on an 8:30 on a Monday, but it's an idealized idea that they're portraying. Phase 2. Then we move on to the next thing. We take a break from those, the violent insurrection and the taking control to have a parade. This is where all of those people. So, interestingly, the parade. I find it fascinating that they allocated 15 minutes to a parade. That this is the route that they chose. This is like more than a mile. It's like 15 blocks. I don't exactly know where Desert Square, which would have been the end, but it's somewhere along this street here. And I don't exactly know where they started, but even that's a long journey to go in 15 minutes. So I don't know, just as a point of reference, I'm sure that the parade, which, show you again, there's the people marching. Again, you can see the people participating. They're, not everybody's game, not everybody takes part, but a couple hundred people do. They estimated different people. Oh, there we go. Now we're past that. Estimated about 500 to maybe 1,100 people took part in the course of the events, like the parade. The parade leads to Red Square, which they've renamed Desert Park, where they have a little rally. You can see there. This is the mayor. Well, this isn't the mayor. The mayor basically gives a speech that he's told to present, and then the leaders of the new movement give some speeches where they make some the grandiose claims that communists are going to make. By the way, Russia has just seized Alaska, returned Alaska. And by the way, this is the beginning of the United Socialist States of America. And by the way, what we're doing here is going to clearly shake the capitalist bourgeois pigs to their core. Whatever. The leaders are interesting too, because in addition to the members of the American Legion, they bring in some professional former communists. Their stories are really interesting. I'm not going to get too deep into them because for time reasons, this is already going to probably go more than a half an hour, so I apologize for that. I'll try to, keep it quick, but there's a lot of cool stuff. Anyway, both of these guys were genuine communists. Ben Gitlow was like one of the leaders of the American Communist Party for a number of years throughout the 20s and 30s, goes to prison a few times for violating like the anti-syndicalism laws of New York and all that sort of stuff. Joseph Zach Kornfelder is a immigrant from Slovakia. I guess it was Austria-Hungary when he first left, but ends up in the United States, gets involved in the Communist Party, is sent over to Moscow to become an agitator, basically to do the job that he's pretending to do here. While he's there, he falls in love with a Russian lady, and they get married and have a child, and he goes off to try to foment, the people's revolution in South America. And while he's there, his wife gets arrested and thrown in the gulags, and he decides, nope, not going to be communist anymore. And so he puts does his best to try and change things. So as these guys, they knew how to, put the speech together to make it seem authentic. And by having them around as part of the program, it lent a needed bit of credulity to the whole affair. Even if they were very much putting on, again, I feel very tempted to just jump into like what kind of communism that they're talking about. They do things like very anarchistic, wing of the Communist Party. But then they take power, they immediately announce all laws, all contracts, all debts under the old regime are now annulled, and we're going to start from scratch. And then there's other stuff where it's just not so. One thing that you gotta very interesting here, if we go back to this idea of the communists being depicted as the things that are counter to what we hold dear as Americans, and that's sort of the educational experience, it's interesting how they treat the unions. Because when they take over, not only do they annul all religion, all churches, all clubs, all political parties, the unions as well are annulled. No more unions. And as you can see, they've nationalized the paper mill here. Here they are arresting all of the managers and the capitalists and anybody who doesn't want to go along with it. And then they announced that, hey, by the way, workers, good news. We've seized the means of production. We're not going to give it any to you, though. And instead, we're going to impose upon you new restrictions. By the way, is not removing your union means that one of the few laws that they did make explicit was no more striking. So as workers, you no longer have any means of like negotiating, those sort of tools, which you think would be part of the communist toolkit. These maybe left-wing unions, but also like we're all going to expect you to be working 4 more hours every day, and you're not going to be paid for any of those hours, and also we're going to give you a pay cut, which is going very far out of their way to depict the communists as being anti-union and anti-workers. Which, I mean, if we're being honest, if there was a genuine attempt to try to take over the communists, put a communist regime in Mosinee, these guys would probably be the ones to benefit because the redistribution of, labor and all of that, like, that's the rhetoric that they were using. But they're very consciously avoiding that and trying not to alienate the unions because in 1950, being a member of your local was part of being patriotic. It was part of what made us who we were, which is interesting because that has not always been the case in the years since. Anyway, phase 3, though, once we have the parades and the speech given, we go back to seizing and consolidating power. How do we do that? Well, we nationalize things. We seize the library, do some book burnings. We go take the firearms, the sporting firearms from the tavern, because that's something the communists would definitely do. There's some other stuff here. The Gitlow, Ben Gitlow apparently gives a speech to the high school students. I don't see much coverage of that. I think maybe the newspapermen and the reporters decided to go elsewhere for that. We'll talk about what they were up to in the meantime. But yeah, taking over the library, where they pulled off the shelves and apparently from the hands of confused patrons, all the capitalist tracts. I don't know exactly what they were grabbing. There's also some misunderstanding or differences in the way that they're presenting what they're grabbing. Maybe it's in any of the anti-communist materials, maybe if it's just things that they disagreed with that they felt were subversive. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. They grabbed them, threw them into the street where they were going to burn them. Again, interesting that none of the photographs stopped. The photographers didn't stick around to see the books being burned, but they definitely were, right? Obviously. They weren't. No, they weren't actually burning the books. Obviously, this is all a show, but that was sort of the idea about the time. Also, just worth noting that, like, I think part of the idea here was the authentic materials that I found, like the planning materials that we have in our collection, of which we don't have a whole lot. But what I did find is it was phrased as removing the anti-communist things from the library. Because during the McCarthy era in the 1950s and sort of the Red Scare, they also banned a lot of books in the United States, which is, they're not necessarily saying that, but obviously this sort of thing is a hallmark of communism, and access to any free thought, that is part of this. Anyway, move on. One of the interesting things is throughout the day, they had, bread lines, because immediately after the communist takeover, obviously the economy is going to completely disappear. It's still there, but they showed how, a pair of boots that was, shoes that was $42 suddenly overnight becomes $580 or something like that. And of course, all of the restaurants, the only food that they have on their menu is black bread, potato soup, and coffee. And so here there is a line for that. Again, the actual nature of how this played out, these restaurants, while it was kind of fun to start out that way, they realized that all of these people who were in Mosinee, probably the most people that have ever been in the city of Mosinee at any one time, up to that point, they kind of are hungry. And if all you have on the menu is potato soup and black bread, they're going to get in their car and drive to Wausau for lunch. So they very quickly sort of like, all right, we'll add to the menu. But at least the idea here, again, showing what this idealized belief of what communism would lead to. And a lot of this stuff isn't necessarily completely out of left field. It's not made out of whole cloth. There are historical precedents for a lot of these things, although some of them maybe wouldn't have happened. Some of them would have. Clearly it's not really about what's happening. They're basing it off of some things and not other things. Anyway, here again, you can see the nationalized. How else would you know that they've taken control but by having a big sign that says it's been nationalized? That's what anyone that takes over is going to do. Also not on the itinerary, but they, of course, did seize Schwindler's Mosinee Times headquarters, and they printed new newspapers, not the Mosinee Times, but a special edition called the Red Star. Actually, here, I have a copy. Let me show you the camera here. It's probably not the best way to do this, but so they printed it on pink paper, so that you knew that it was communist, and of course you got the picture of Stalin, and then there's a lot of like the other stuff, all of the other pre-created proclamations and all of that was included as well. So yeah, they seize him. They also do this thing that I'm not entirely sure. I couldn't really find the real good justification for what they were trying to go against, but they stop a train in the afternoon, park a Jeep onto it, point guns at them, pull the engineers and the workers off of it, kind of harass the passengers. I don't know if the intention here was to say that under communism, this is part of the nationalization of the train network and trains don't run on the time, or maybe they were just going with a generic, authoritarian takeover a community. You want to, limit travel in and out. It's sure made for some good photographs, though. So if nothing else, there's that. There's a lot of that sort of stuff. There's also, I'm not going to get into it, but there's a really confusing bit at the theater where they have like a very clear repudiation of Russian propaganda that they then have playing, but then they decide that the communists wouldn't actually let that play, so then they just kind of like stopped that, but they, instead of putting real propaganda like they kind of planned, they realized that was probably not a good idea, so they just put up a picture of Joseph Stalin, and that was what they did. There's some very confusing activities here that I'm not going to get too far off tangent. But I think that is not necessarily this all came together in like 2 months. And B, this is also very endemic, representative of the Red Scare, in which, maybe we don't necessarily need to think all of this logically out. The sentiment is more important than the details. So phase 4. Eventually, we got to lead to the end of this, right? Because the communists have taken over, but by the end of the day, we don't want to beat communists on May 2nd. So how do we end this? Well, their solution is kind of just this. Hey guys, let's just stop being communists. They have another get-together at the formerly Red Square, now back to Desert Park. There's some speech given. That speech in, I think it was the head of the Wisconsin American Legion, from Port Washington, I think. He says, hey, citizens of Mosinee and Marathon County, you're real Americans, remember, stop being communist. And so they do. They take off their, red stars that they had been given. They take out their paperwork and they throw it in a big pile. The Boy Scouts start a fire, and they have a big bonfire in the center of the park. They have some speeches. They sing God Bless America, and everybody goes home American, and we're no longer communist. Which is a little anticlimactic, and maybe part of this might have been for the fact that the mayor was not, I don't know. The one kind of asterisk kind of hanging over all of this is that Mayor Cronenwetter, who had been an active part of the planning and sort of the whole presentation, the first guy to be arrested, all of that, he gets out of his car to come be part of this in the evening, and as he's walking towards the congregation getting together, he says, he feels a little funny, and then he collapses. And what we know now is having a cerebral hemorrhage, he falls into a coma, and a few days later passes away, which was obviously not planned, but does kind of detract from the headlines a little bit that the mayor died. There's also there's a Methodist preacher, Reverend, I think, who was featured in some of the accounts because he was showing the reporters where he would stash his Bible if in the organ pipes if the communists came looking for him, and was one of those people pulled off. He had a heart attack a week after this, and died a few hours after Mayor Cronenwetter. And obviously it's hard to say whether those were directly because of the events or not, but it certainly is coincidental timing. But obviously, hard to know whether Cronenwether would have had a maybe more coherent end, but also, this thing was all thought out as being a celebration of Americanism by making an other, making somebody that we can, the communists as being the bad guys. And so, this is as good as you need. And from the other side of things, like the media presentation, they got their pictures, they got their stories. They don't really need a nice, coherent bow on the end of it to tie everything together. So they just stop being communists. They sing God Bless America, have a bonfire, and that's that. So, okay, how was it successful? Well, in the sense of the media portrayal, absolutely. If the idea was to preempt the actual communists from getting coverage in the newspapers, it's beyond the wildest dreams of the organizers. It's get picked up all over the place. I mean, this is the newspaper in Wausau, the full page. Actually, before I go to the Life magazine, one of the weird ones here, everybody else makes it very, very explicitly clear that these are not actual communists. It's not actually seized. They kind of use very subtle, like they just say things like, and I don't know if they're making this stuff up, where they talk about how what are they doing? Well, they're banning any soda that isn't strawberry or cherry, because those are red flavors. Communists are red. Stuff like that, where you're just like, oh, this is a joke. And maybe they just kind of knew that. Everybody else makes a point of saying that. But obviously, even from local papers up to Life magazine, in May 15th edition, they had a two-page spread with photographs and, the explanation of here's the takeover. So what is the consensus here? How are people talking about it? Well, obviously, the actual communists don't like the portrayal of it. They see it and declare that this isn't a real attempt to show communism. They suggest that maybe the actual Communist Party in Wisconsin should take over Mosinee for another day, maybe the 4th of July. Let's see what our presentation is. That would only be fair, right? They don't get that chance. Other left-leaning media things were also very kind of critical of this, saying that, not to say that the people that were organizing this or taking part were intending this, but they noted that this is very similar to the demonization of communists that were happening in pre-Nazi Germany. And I know that talking about, Nazi Germany on the internet is kind of passé. It kind of doesn't mean as much as it used to now with the internet, but they certainly made the enemy of the communists. And again, it's not to say that they're making the American Legion are neo-Nazis or anything. It wasn't necessarily that way, but they were making a point of saying these sort of hey, let's everybody put on this pageant, let's make a stunt, was uncomfortably close to maybe providing a route for more authoritarian people to take control of the narrative. And maybe that's not great. Even the people maybe in the center and maybe more on the right side of things were also kind of confused. They understood and appreciated the message, but is this really worth it? Wasn't there better things that we could have been doing instead of taking over a town? It's great for the camera, but is it something that we're going to reproduce? Probably not. In fact, there had been, over the course of the next few years, attempts to try to do this in other places in the United States, and none of them get remotely close to the media attention. It's kind of a one-and-done thing, and then people were like, okay, we saw that already. And maybe it was 1950, maybe it was just the moment, but that seems to be the case. So, okay, it's not, that's the media side of things, but obviously, John Decker's initial conception was an education for the people of Mosinee. So did the people of Mosinee use this opportunity to reflect on communism and what it meant to be an American? Well, maybe. I don't know. I think that it's hard to say. I think that the people, his takeaway, by the way, at the end of all of this was that was a lot of fun. That was a blast. Which is at odds with, say, Schwindler's, the newspaper guy here, who thought it was really important work. And I don't want to say that he's a humorless guy, but he comes across as being a little intense when it comes to these sort of things. And he would not have thought it would fun. In fact, apparently he chastised, the school kids of advance, saying, and don't you laugh at any of this. This is not fun. This shouldn't be fun. This should be a serious contemplation of what communism would be like. So there's sort of difference of opinions, and ultimately, when it comes to the accounts of the people at the time, they thought it was fun. Like, I mean, you look at this guy. The people in the background, they're smiling. In almost all the pictures that I could find, there are people that, it's kind of fun to dress up and pretend to be, even if they're communists, even if we pretend to be the bad guys, hey, look at all these. That was one of the things. The way that the media seemed to be very serious about this did convince at least one or two people that, like, said, yeah, I got a lot out of this. So that was great, because seeing them being serious meant I should take it serious. But yeah, ultimately, a lot of these guys, it was a fun opportunity. And I can see how it didn't necessarily lead to, it's just a fun moment, I guess. And I guess I don't know where to necessarily leave this except to say that I think that you can look at this event and draw parallels to what has happened since. But I don't think you necessarily need to recognize that, like, this is an interesting event. And if nothing else, I think it is really good explanation of what it was like to be in the middle of America in 1950 during the Red Scare, during the very fear, real fear of communists, of the socialists or the Soviets having atomic weapons, and what does this look like, and who among us might be on their side. It's confusing, it's a little messy, and ultimately, it's a fun little thing. It's a fun little story that we get to talk about Mosinee. And nothing else, I think, how often do people in Mosinee or Marathon County get to see, local people depicted in national news coverage? Not very often. So that's kind of a fun little notable thing. And hopefully you learned a little bit. Sorry, I went a little longer than I normally would. It was hard to nail this one down to my usual half an hour or less, but interesting story. And maybe we'll revisit and talk more about other stuffs that happened from this, but for now, I think I'll maybe call it there. Next week, I'm going to be back, and a lot different story here. We're going to talk a little spotlight on the story and the life of Jerry Visti, who, if you're not aware, Wausau resident, who just turned 100 not too long ago. And Jerry's been an important part of the formation and development of the Historical Society here, so we want to honor him in his life. Just a little story about him. Also, if you've made it this far, you might be interested to know that we have a History Speaks coming up this weekend, so on Saturday here, where Gil Bertner is going to be sharing his experiences as a pilot, a helicopter combat pilot during Vietnam War. And so he's going to share a little bit about that, and it's going to be a great time as well. So that's this Saturday at 2 p.m. If you're interested, come out to that. Anyway, with that, I think I'll maybe call it. Thanks for watching. If you made it this far, again, excuse me. Hopefully you enjoyed. And learned a little bit about a very interesting, kind of fun little story in the history of Marathon County.